It is the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, and beneath the shattered garden of the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin, 9 meters of concrete and earth separate two different worlds. Above, the city is dying. Soviet artillery falls at a rate of 1 shell every few seconds, a rhythm so constant that soldiers on both sides have stopped flinching at individual explosions and instead listen for the gaps. Below, in a cramped warren of rooms known as the Führerbunker, the air smells of diesel fumes, damp concrete, and cigarette smoke. A single gunshot, muffled by 2 closed doors, goes almost unnoticed amid the barrage overhead. It will be another day before the soldiers fighting their way through the ruins above even suspect what has happened beneath their feet. This is the story of the final hours of Nazi Germany's leadership, told through the eyes of the men who physically broke into the last redoubt of the regime, and the extraordinary detective work that followed as they tried to work out exactly what they had found. It is a story with tanks and flamethrowers in it, certainly, but its true drama lies somewhere stranger, in scorched fragments of bone, in dental records smuggled out of a ruined city, and in a decades-long argument over how a war that killed tens of millions of people could end in a hole in the ground barely bigger than a suburban basement. Why does this matter, more than 80 years on? Because the manner in which the Third Reich's leadership met its end shaped the mythology of the Second World War almost as much as the war itself. Rumor, Soviet secrecy, and the sheer difficulty of confirming a death in a city being fought over meter by meter created a vacuum that conspiracy theories rushed to fill for decades. Understanding what Soviet soldiers actually found in that bunker and how they found it is essential to understanding why the truth took so long to surface, and why some people, even now, refuse to accept it. By the spring of 1945, Berlin was a city that should never have had to be fought for at all, at least not in the eyes of the men ordered to defend it. Nazi Germany's military situation had collapsed months earlier. The Ardennes offensive, the last major German gamble in the West, had burned through reserves of fuel, armor, and trained manpower that could never be replaced. In the East, the Vistula-Oder offensive of January 1945 had carried Soviet forces from central Poland to within striking distance of the German capital in a matter of weeks, at a pace that stunned even Soviet planners. The problem facing the German High Command was not merely that they were losing, it was that they no longer possessed the means to lose slowly. Divisions existed on paper that had perhaps a third of their nominal strength in the field. Panzer units were being scraped together from repair depots and training schools. By April, the defense of Berlin itself relied heavily on the Volkssturm, a home guard of boys as young as 12 and men in their 60s, alongside battered Wehrmacht remnants and foreign volunteer SS units fighting, in many cases, with nothing left to return to. Against this, the Soviet forces converging on the city numbered roughly 2.5 million men, organized into 3 fronts under Marshals Georgy Zhukov, Ivan Konev, and Konstantin Rokossovsky. The sheer scale of artillery involved is difficult to convey in ordinary terms. On the Silo Heights alone, the last significant natural defensive line before Berlin, Zhukov massed over 8,000 artillery pieces for the opening bombardment, alongside anti-aircraft searchlights positioned to blind the defenders, a tactic that produced mixed results but reflected the almost industrial scale of the assault being planned. To put that artillery concentration in perspective, Soviet planners had assembled something in the order of 250 guns for every kilometer of front line at the point of main effort, a density that meant, in practical terms, a shell landing somewhere along that stretch of ground roughly every second or two during the heaviest phases of the bombardment. German defenders sheltering in the Silo Heights described the noise not as individual explosions but as a continuous roar, punctuated by the deeper concussion of the largest caliber weapons, and experienced survivors likened to standing inside a passing goods train that simply never finished passing. What made Berlin's situation genuinely without precedent, even by the standards of a war that had already produced Stalingrad and Leningrad, was the combination of a doomed defense with a population of roughly 3 million civilians still trapped inside the city as the fighting closed in. Food supplies had dwindled to near nothing. The water and sewage systems, already damaged by years of Allied bombing raids, began failing entirely as fighting reached the city center, and reports from the period describe residents queuing for hours at working pumps under artillery fire simply to fetch drinking water. It was, in every meaningful sense, a city being asked to die twice over, once through military destruction and once through the collapse of the basic infrastructure that had kept its people alive. The existing German solution to this problem was, in blunt terms, denial. Hitler had already rejected repeated proposals to withdraw forces westward to surrender to the Americans and British rather than the Soviets, a decision with enormous consequences for millions of German soldiers and civilians. Goebbels' propaganda machine continued to promise relief armies and wonder weapons that existed mostly in name. The gap between the military reality on the ground and the fantasy being maintained in briefings became, by mid-April, almost total. It is this gap between what Berlin's defenders were told and what was actually converging upon them that made the battle for the city not merely difficult, but, in any meaningful strategic sense, already lost before the first Soviet shell landed within the city limits. The innovation that made the final assault on Berlin possible was not a single weapon, but an entire method of urban warfare, refined over 3.5 years of brutal experience, much of it earned at catastrophic cost at Stalingrad in 1942 and 1943. Soviet military planners, working out of headquarters that had spent years studying exactly this kind of fighting, had developed what came to be known as the assault group system, a doctrine built around small, self-contained units designed specifically to fight through dense urban terrain, building by building. A typical Soviet assault group for the Berlin operation might contain a rifle platoon of perhaps 30 men, reinforced with combat engineers carrying satchel charges, a section of submachine gunners for close-quarters clearing, and, crucially, direct support from self-propelled guns such as the ISU-152, a vehicle so heavily armed that German soldiers nicknamed its shell the Beast Slayer for its ability to punch through the thickest tank armor and, when fired into a building, to bring down entire floors in a single hit. The recoil alone, when the gun fired, was powerful enough to visibly rock the 60-ton chassis backward, an effect roughly equivalent to a loaded lorry being shunted several centimeters by a single blow. These assault groups were designed to move through buildings and cellars rather than along exposed streets, tunneling from house to house where possible, using explosives to blast through internal walls to avoid Panzerfaust ambushes waiting in doorways and windows. The Panzerfaust, a simple but devastatingly effective German anti-tank weapon costing only a fraction of a tank's value to produce, had turned Berlin's ruined streets into a shooting gallery for Soviet armor, and it was this very weapon that forced the Red Army to abandon conventional tank columns in favor of the slower, more methodical assault group approach. Soviet commanders had learned, at enormous cost during the initial push into the city, that sending tanks down open boulevards without infantry screening simply invited destruction from Panzerfaust teams hidden in cellar windows and rubble piles, often manned by teenage Hitler Youth conscripts with only rudimentary training. The response was to marry armor tightly to infantry, with tank commanders instructed never to advance more than a short distance ahead of the assault groups clearing buildings on either flank, a discipline that slowed the overall advance considerably but sharply reduced losses once properly enforced. Communication within these groups relied on a mixture of runners, hand signals, and short-range radio sets, since the dense rubble and structural steel of a bombed city played havoc with radio propagation, an ordinary and frustrating technical problem that nonetheless shaped tactics on the ground almost as much as enemy resistance did. Combat engineers attached to each group carried satchel charges weighing several kilograms, enough explosive to collapse a load-bearing wall or blow a connecting passage between adjoining cellars, allowing troops to move an entire block without ever stepping into the street above, where German defenders had pre-registered artillery and mortar fire on every visible junction. Manufacturing behind Soviet lines had, by this stage of the war, achieved a scale that Germany could no longer match. Factories in the Urals, relocated wholesale from Western Russia in the desperate evacuations of 1941, were producing self-propelled guns and ammunition at a rate that dwarfed German output, even accounting for the disruption caused by Allied bombing of German industry. Exact production figures for the specific units committed to Berlin remain difficult to pin down with total precision, given the chaos of record-keeping in the war's final weeks. But Soviet industrial output for heavy self-propelled guns in 1945 is generally estimated in the low thousands for the year, a figure Germany simply could not approach for comparable vehicles. The fighting inside Berlin, once the outer defenses collapsed, took on a character almost medieval in its intensity, despite the 20th century weaponry involved. The battle for the Reichstag building, stormed on April 30th by soldiers of the Third Shock Army, became one of the most mythologized episodes of the entire war, culminating in the raising of a Soviet flag over the building's dome, an image staged and restaged for photographers in the days that followed to create the iconic record now familiar from countless documentaries. Barely 500 meters away, soldiers of the same offensive were, without fully realizing it, closing in on the Reich Chancellery complex above the Führerbunker itself. Fighting through the Tiergarten and the government quarter meant advancing through parkland turned into a moonscape of shell craters, past anti-aircraft guns that had been depressed to fire directly at ground targets, an improvisation that reflected just how thin German defensive resources had become. Soviet accounts describe SS units fighting with the particular desperation of men who understood, correctly, that surrender offered them little mercy given the atrocities committed on the Eastern Front by some of these same formations. Fighting in this final government quarter often reduced to close combat within individual rooms and stairwells of ministry buildings that had, only weeks earlier, housed the ordinary bureaucratic machinery of the Nazi state. Soviet soldiers later recounted finding filing cabinets still full of paperwork and desks left mid-task, an eerie contrast with the ferocity of the fighting taking place in the corridors outside. Casualties on both sides during these final days remain difficult to state with precision, since unit records for German formations disintegrated entirely as command structures collapsed. But Soviet losses for the Berlin operation as a whole are generally put at over 80,000 dead, a staggering figure for a campaign lasting barely 2 weeks and a stark illustration of how costly urban combat against a determined, cornered defense could be, even against an enemy already beaten in every strategic sense. If you are finding this interesting so far, a quick subscribe genuinely helps the channel more than you might think. So do stick around for what happened when Soviet troops actually broke into the bunker complex itself. By May 2nd, organized German resistance in Berlin had effectively ceased, and Soviet troops of the 79th Rifle Corps entered the Reich Chancellery Gardens to find a scene that would puzzle military intelligence officers for years afterward. 2 partially burned bodies lay in a shell crater near the bunker's emergency exit, doused, it later emerged, in petrol in a hurried attempt at cremation that the ongoing artillery bombardment had made impossible to complete properly. Soviet counterintelligence officers from Smuggled, the wartime military counterintelligence organization, took charge of the site and began an investigation that would remain almost entirely classified for nearly half a century. The comparison between how different Allied powers approached the discovery and the broader question of urban assault doctrine is instructive. American and British forces never fought their way into Berlin at all, a fact often overlooked. General Dwight Eisenhower made the deliberate decision in March 1945 to halt the Western Allied advance at the Elbe River, roughly 100 kilometers from Berlin, judging the political prize not worth the certain casualties of storming a heavily defended capital, and preferring instead to let Soviet forces absorb that cost. This decision, still debated by historians, meant that the entire discovery of the bunker and the physical evidence within it fell exclusively into Soviet hands, with all the secrecy and mixed messaging that Stalin's government subsequently applied to the story. German defensive doctrine for Berlin, by contrast with the coordinated Soviet assault group system, was fragmented almost by necessity. Hitler's own order that Berlin be defended to the last man reflected less a coherent operational plan than a refusal to accept the war's outcome, and it left individual unit commanders improvising defenses with radios that often could not reach higher headquarters and supply lines that had effectively ceased to function. Where Soviet forces entered the battle with a doctrine refined over years of costly lessons, German defenders entered it with courage, certainly in many documented instances, but with almost no coherent citywide plan beyond holding position until overrun. SMERSH investigators recovered burned jaw fragments and dental bridgework from the crater, and it was here that the investigation's most consequential piece of detective work took place. Soviet officers tracked down Hitler's dentist's assistant and his dental technician, both of whom had survived the war, and showed them the recovered remains alongside dental charts and X-rays that had been kept from Hitler's own treatment records. Both identified the distinctive bridgework as matching their former patient with what they described as certainty. This identification, conducted with a rigor that later forensic reviews in the 1970s and 2000s broadly confirmed, was nonetheless kept secret by Stalin, who reportedly suspected Hitler might have escaped and preferred to let uncertainty unsettle the Western Allies rather than confirm a death that Soviet propaganda could otherwise have claimed credit for. The psychological impact of the bunker's fall and the uncertainty Stalin deliberately cultivated around it proved almost as significant historically as the physical fact of the deaths themselves. Rumors that Hitler had escaped to South America circulated for decades, fueled directly by the Soviet Union's refusal to publish its own findings, and inadvertently handed conspiracy theorists a gift that persists on the Internet to this day. It was not until Soviet archives began opening after the collapse of the USSR in 1991, and particularly with the publication of detailed Soviet investigation files in the 1990s and 2000s, that the full documentary record of what SMERSH had found in 1945 became available to independent historians. The legacy of the bunker's discovery, then, is really a story about the danger of secrecy in the aftermath of catastrophic events. Soviet forensic work in May 1945 was, by most later assessments, careful and largely accurate, but Stalin's decision to sit on the findings for political advantage created a 50-year information gap that conspiracy and speculation rushed to fill. Fragments of the bunker complex itself were largely demolished by East German authorities in the 1980s, precisely to prevent the site becoming a shrine for neo-Nazi sympathizers, and today the location, in reunified Berlin, is marked only by an unassuming information board in a car park near Wilhelmstrasse, deliberately unremarkable by design. The wider influence of the Soviet urban assault doctrine perfected in Berlin extended well beyond 1945. Soviet and later Warsaw Pact military academies continued teaching the assault group concept as a foundational model for city fighting for decades afterward, and elements of the approach, close integration of infantry, armor, and engineers operating in small semi-independent teams, can be traced through later Soviet operations and even, at some remove, through NATO's own evolving urban warfare doctrine developed during the Cold War as planners on both sides contemplated the grim possibility of fighting through the cities of a divided Europe. Meanwhile, the physical evidence recovered from the Chancellery Garden, the dental remains that first confirmed the identification in 1945, remained in Soviet and later Russian custody, examined again by forensic teams in the 1990s using techniques unavailable to the original investigators, examinations that consistently reaffirmed the original 1945 conclusions rather than overturning them. It is worth returning, finally, to that shell crater in the Chancellery Garden on the afternoon of May 2, 1945, because it captures something the rest of the story can obscure. A war that had reshaped the entire world ended, in its most immediate and physical sense, not with a grand surrender ceremony, but with a handful of exhausted Soviet soldiers picking through burned debris in a bombed-out garden, uncertain of exactly what they had found. The city above them was still burning in places. The war in the Pacific had months left to run, and yet here, in this unremarkable patch of ruined earth, the regime that had launched the deadliest conflict in human history had, quite literally, run out of ground to stand on. What the Red Army achieved in Berlin was not merely a military victory, but the physical, forensic end of a regime that many, even at the time, struggled to believe could actually be finished. Soldiers had fought street by street, cellar by cellar, floor by floor, to reach a 9-meter hole in the ground that held the answer to a question the entire world was asking. They found burned bodies in a crater. They found dental records. They found, eventually, an answer that took decades to be believed. The war in Europe ended not with certainty, but with a secret, and secrets, however carefully buried, tend to surface eventually. Berlin fell in ruins, its defenders scattered or dead, its leadership reduced to ash in a shallow crater meters from where they had once dreamed of ruling a continent. That is the story the concrete and steel eventually told, whether Stalin wished the world to hear it or not.